In the year 2073, the world was a different place. The effects of climate change had become more pronounced, and humanity had been forced to adapt in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades ago. The rising sea levels had swallowed up coastal cities, extreme weather events had become the norm, and the world's biodiversity had been significantly reduced. But in the face of these challenges, humanity had shown remarkable resilience and ingenuity. The city of New Amsterdam, formerly known as New York, was a testament to this resilience. The city had been one of the hardest hit by the rising sea levels, but instead of abandoning it, the people had adapted. The city had been transformed into a modern-day Venice, with canals replacing streets and boats replacing cars. The skyscrapers that had once touched the sky were now partially submerged, but they were still inhabited, with the lower floors converted into watertight spaces used for storage and utilities. The city's infrastructure had been completely overhauled. The subway system had been replaced by a network of underwater tunnels, and the city's power was now supplied by a combination of offshore wind farms and floating solar panels. The city had also become a hub for aquaculture, with floating farms producing a significant portion of the city's food. The people of New Amsterdam had also changed their lifestyles to adapt to their new environment. They had become expert swimmers and boaters, and many had taken up fishing as a hobby and a source of food. They had also become more conscious of their impact on the environment, with recycling and composting becoming a part of everyday life. Meanwhile, in the Sahara Desert, another transformation was taking place. The desert had been slowly turning green, thanks to a massive reforestation project. The project, known as the Great Green Wall, had been started in the early 21st century as a way to combat desertification and create jobs in some of the poorest regions of Africa. By 2073, the project had been a resounding success, with the desert now home to a vast forest that stretched from Senegal in the west to Djibouti in the east. The forest had become a haven for biodiversity, with species that had been on the brink of extinction now thriving. It had also become a major carbon sink, helping to offset some of the carbon emissions that were still being produced. The people living in the region had benefited as well, with the forest providing them with food, fuel, and a source of income. In other parts of the world, similar transformations were taking place. In the Arctic, communities had adapted to the melting ice by building floating villages and developing new hunting and fishing techniques. In the Pacific Islands, people had built floating islands to escape the rising sea levels. And in the world's major cities, green roofs and vertical gardens had become commonplace, helping to reduce the urban heat island effect and provide a source of local food. But while these adaptations had helped to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change, they were not enough to stop it. The world's climate was still warming, and the effects were still being felt. Extreme weather events were becoming more frequent and more severe, and many species were still at risk of extinction. In response to this, a new field of science had emerged: geoengineering. This involved large-scale interventions in the Earth's natural systems to counteract climate change. Some of the proposed solutions included spraying aerosols into the atmosphere to reflect sunlight, fertilizing the oceans to promote the growth of carbon-absorbing phytoplankton, and even building giant mirrors in space to deflect solar radiation. These solutions were controversial, with many scientists warning of the potential risks and unintended consequences. But with the effects of climate change becoming increasingly severe, many people were willing to consider them. By 2073, several geoengineering projects had been launched, with the hope that they could buy humanity some time to reduce its carbon emissions and transition to a more sustainable way of life. The future of climate change was uncertain, but one thing was clear: humanity had shown that it was capable of adapting to even the most challenging circumstances. Whether it was transforming a city into a modern-day Venice, turning a desert into a forest, or developing new technologies to manipulate the Earth's climate, people had shown a remarkable ability to innovate and adapt. But while these adaptations were necessary, they were not a substitute for reducing carbon emissions and transitioning to a more sustainable way of life. The future of climate change would depend not just on our ability to adapt, but also on our willingness to change. Subscribe.